You admitted that you had previously slapped or tapped Leyland James. Right, you shake your head. Right.
Okay. I just stood up like that. I went right foot hang. And he fell on the floor.
Everything looked perfect. A growing family, the promise of an adopted son. Until the illusion cracked. In the quiet town of Barrow-in-Furness, in England's northwest, an ostensibly ordinary home held a devastating secret. What began as a hopeful adoption ended in tragedy. This is the story of Laura Castle, a former care worker turned prospective mother whose life took a disastrous turn when she and her husband welcomed a vulnerable baby into their home. It's a story of trust betrayed, of a child placed into care, and of institutional oversight challenged. Most importantly, it's a cautionary tale with lessons for us all about vigilance, duty, and the hidden signs that normality may not tell the whole story. It was August 2020, when 13-month-old Leyland James Corkill was placed with Laura Castle and her husband Scott. The little boy had been taken into care just 2 days after birth. The Castles had been approved by the local adoption panel overseen by Cumbria County Council's Children's Services Department and matched to Leyland James on the basis of providing a safe, nurturing home for a child in care. In the early months, the outward picture was what anyone might expect. Prospective adopters, a baby in need of a secure attachment, a local authority hoping for a success story. But beneath the surface, subtle signs began to emerge, concerns that would later loom large. By November 2020, less than 4 months into the placement, social workers had begun to raise concerns. During a home visit, Laura reported she did not love Leyland James and was struggling to bond with him. The panel began discussing whether removal might be necessary. According to court testimony, Laura responded, "He was not going anywhere. My extended family love him." This refusal to engage with the warning signs would become one of the crucial threads in the unfolding tragedy. The adoption process is built on more than paperwork. It depends on emotional connection, capacity to cope with difficult moments, and resilience in the face of stress. In this case, those elements were already under strain. Still, the home looked like what it was meant to, a welcoming environment. But the veneer of everyday life started to crack. In the weeks that followed, mobile phone messages between the Castles revealed a deeper tension. Laura called the baby a proper knobhead, a whinge bag, and said she was going to lose my mind, struggling with all this. Her husband's messages were similarly troubling. He described the baby as a dick baby, fat shit, toss bag. He claimed he was ashamed at sending the messages, but said it was meant in humor. Behind closed doors, the stress of parenting a young child, especially a baby in care, with possibly early trauma and high needs, was mounting. Laura admitted she had leathered the baby, an expression she later clarified as meaning smacked, but still indicative of a disciplinary stance and frustration. These were not just isolated frustrations. They were early indicators of a mismatch between the expectations of adoption and the lived reality. For adoptive parents, this gap can become a fault line. The scenario invites 2 psychological dynamics. 1. Attachment failure. The immediate statement of, "I don't love him," is a red flag. When a carer cannot bond with a child in care, the risk of neglect or worse increases. 2. Displacement of frustration. The messaging reveals Laura's internal resentment. She perceives the baby's crying, his needs, as an imposition rather than a call for help. On 6 January 2021, at 6 a.m., the breaking point came. Laura woke her husband, who had been sleeping after a night shift, clutching Leyland James's body in her arms. She claimed he had fallen from the sofa, hit his head and was gasping. The ambulance was called. The boy rushed to hospital. Inside, however, the forensic evidence told a very different story. Experts determined the brain, eye, and spinal injuries were catastrophic and required very severe or considerable impact and oscillation forces to have been sustained. In short, this was not a fall. Forensic pathology is brutally honest. It doesn't lie. When the medical opinion contradicted the narrative, the facade of normalcy collapsed. What followed was a police investigation that peeled back layer after layer of cover story and deflection. At first, Laura told anyone who would listen the death was a tragic accident while her husband was sleeping. That version looked neat, convenient. But when police started digging, they found the truth was far messier. In footage released by the investigation, Laura claimed the baby was on her knee after breakfast. Then she leaned over to put away wipes. The baby fell, hit the armrest of the sofa, then fell to the floor. Within minutes, she jumped to her feet and told officers, "I picked him up. He was struggling," like gasping. Yet the forensic testimony was unambiguous. Severe shaking and blunt force trauma must have been involved. The combined forces could not be reconciled with the sofa fall account. Prosecutor Michael Brady QC told the court, "It is likely that Castle smashed the back of Leyland James's head with significant force against the armrest of the sofa or possibly a table." Meanwhile, the home visit concerns from months earlier resurfaced. Laura had said she did not feel love, that she was struggling to cope, that she was regretting the adoption. These were crucial pieces in understanding motive, and the absence of protective intervention. Her husband, Scott Castle, though present in the home, was ultimately acquitted of child cruelty and allowing the death of a child. The jury accepted he did not partake in the fatal actions. The investigation also considered the institutional response. The local authority acknowledged the case as truly shocking, pledged an independent review, and conceded things should have been done differently. From a psychological lens, what can we observe? There are 4 factors at play. Stress reaction. Laura's messages reflect a carer under stress, possibly unprepared for the emotional demands of caring for a baby with high needs. Resentment and displacement. The baby's crying becomes a trigger, the target of frustration rather than responded to with empathy. Lack of emotional bond. The earlier admission of not loving signals a critical absence of attachment, which increases the risk of harm when things go wrong. Denial and rationalization. The sofa fall narrative is an attempt to rationalize what happened, to maintain self-image and avoid responsibility. Together, they form a psychologically dangerous mix. When combined that with inadequate oversight, the result can be catastrophic. The trial of Laura Castle at Preston Crown Court saw her shift position dramatically. Initially denying murder, she pleaded guilty to manslaughter the day the jury was sworn in. Yet the jury, upon hearing expert evidence and reviewing medical data, convicted her of murder and child cruelty in roughly 2.5 hours of deliberation. In sentencing, the judge, Jeremy Baker KC, sitting as a senior judge, said, "Precisely what took place on 6 January may never be known. Even now I do not consider you told the jury the full circumstances leading up to the death of Leyland James." He held that Laura's version significantly underplays the extent and degree of violence which you inflicted. The sentence imposed life imprisonment with a minimum term of 18 years. There are important legal and systemic takeaways here. The shift from accident to admission of manslaughter to conviction of murder underscores how forensic evidence can upend simplistic narratives. Institutional oversight was called into question. The adoption panel had been warned by November, yet the placement continued. The sentencing remarks highlight how the court emphasizes not just the act, but the capacity and motive behind it, especially where the offender held a position of trust. For victims' advocates and child protection professionals, this case became a benchmark. It sent a clear message. Placement of children in care settings demands not only administrative compliance, but emotional resilience and safeguarding readiness. In the wake of the conviction, the Cumbria County Council publicly apologized and launched an independent review into how the Castles were approved as adopters and the failing safeguards around the placement of Leyland James. The review represented more than a checklist. It was a signal that these tragedies must be learned from, not simply punished. There are key lessons. 1. Attachment-based screening. Prospective adopters must demonstrate not only capability, but willingness to form emotional bonds, especially with children whose early life has been disrupted. 2. Early warning signs matter. Admissions of lack of love, frustration with crying, derogatory messages. These should trigger urgent intervention before harm occurs. 3. Monitoring and support post-placement. Even after formal approval, adoptive arrangements must be actively supervised, with home visits, emotional check-ins, and real-time risk assessments. 4. Transparency and accountability. Local authorities must respond swiftly to concerns. Risk cannot be deferred. 5. Public awareness. Professionals working in adoption, foster care, and child protection must be attuned to the subtle dynamics of parental resentment, caretaker fatigue, and emotional disconnection. This story underscores the paramount importance of recognizing the emotional realities of caregiving, especially for children coming from difficult early lives. And to the broader public, it reminds us that the brightest-looking facade may conceal distress beneath. On the surface, Laura Castle appeared to be fulfilling a societal ideal, a caring couple willing to adopt a child in need. But the psychological underpinnings began to erode that image from within. For example, identity and expectation, emotional disconnection, escalation of frustration into violence, denial and narrative construction, and role of support and isolation. In short, the tragic outcome in this case stemmed not from one dramatic breakdown, but from a series of overlooked signs: emotional disconnection, frustration turned inward, poor monitoring, narrative control, and institutional gaps. The illustration here is of how normal family life can mask real vulnerabilities, and that vigilance must be continuous. As we conclude this account of what happened to Leyland James and the role Laura Castle played, we must emphasize: this is not about sensationalism, but prevention, education, and reform. The lessons here are urgent for adoptive agencies, child protection services, carers, and society at large. Children in care are among the most vulnerable members of society. When placed into homes, the expectation is not only that they will be safe, but that the carers will have resilience, emotional capacity, and institutional support to navigate complex needs. When any of those fail, when warning signs are dismissed, when emotional disconnection is ignored, when the veneer of normality hides danger, the result can be irreversible. For viewers of this channel, if you are involved in adoption, foster care, children's services, or even as a community member, ask yourself: are carers receiving emotional support and supervision beyond the paperwork? Are professionals attuned to the emotional statements of adoptive parents? Are children monitored not just for physical safety, but for emotional well-being and caregiver attachment? Are agencies transparent, accountable, and responsive when concerns emerge? The story of Laura Castle and Leyland James is a tragedy, but it need not repeat itself. With vigilance, clear communication, emotional attunement, and robust oversight, such cases can be prevented. Awareness is our strongest tool, not just reacting after the fact, but recognizing the fragile lines where things begin to crack.